Hi folks, welcome to another edition of Government Matters. My name is Mike Dobbs. And normally on Government Matters, we stick pretty close to home in terms of the subject matter. So many of you may be watching this and going, oh Mike, you're just going to talk about something that really doesn't apply to the grassroots, the average person. Au contraire. We're going to be talking about the freedom of speech. And this is a topic that's coming up more and more and more. What is the freedom of speech? How is it protected? How is it being eroded? Now, why does this have something to do with you? Well, the bottom line is the freedom of speech protects a lot of stuff that you might say or that you might do. And with its erosion, you yourself may find yourself in a very bad situation. So, with me today are two people who know a lot about freedom of speech. We have the enterprise reporter from the Springfield Republican, Nama Sampath, right there. And then Gerald Duquette, who is a professor of political science at Central Connecticut State College. University. we have an academic, and we have someone who's dealing with freedom of speech issues every day at her job. So I just, I'm going to read something that I'll read a couple things just to set us off and set the tone. Now, first of all, for those of you who do not know what the First Amendment is, let's go there. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. You cannot get a more potent sentence than that in government. I'm sorry. I mean, that just sort of sets the tone for what this country is supposed to be all about. But on January 20th, President Trump signed an executive order, and the order was to restore and protect freedom of speech. And the question is, why was this order signed? And it read, over the last 4 years, the previous administration trampled free speech rights by censoring American speech on online platforms, often by exerting substantial coercive pressure on third parties, such as social media companies, to moderate, deplatform, is that a word? Deplatform? Or otherwise suppress speech that the federal government did not approve. Suppress speech the federal government did not approve, under the guise of combating misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And again, is that a word?
I don't think that.
I don't think that's a word either. Yeah. The federal government infringed upon the constitutionally protected speech rights of American citizens across the United States in a manner that advanced the government's preferred narrative about significant matters of public debate. Government censorship of speech is intolerable in a free society. So bear with me. He's reacting to the fact that, in fact, PBS reported this on August 27th, 2024, that Mark Zuckerberg, who's the CEO of Meta, which owns Facebook, among other things, said that senior Biden administration officials pressured Facebook to censor some COVID-19 content during the pandemic and vowed that the social media giant would push back if it faced such demands again. Now, excuse me, apparently the government was very concerned about some of the definite malinformation about COVID at a time that we were worried that our population was really suffering. Sorry about that. As it turns out, he did not give in to the federal government. He says, Zuckerberg said, I believe the government pressure was wrong, and I regret that we were not more outspoken about it. So this now is a big talking point about MAGA. We got to get freedom of speech so we can say whatever is going to go on. However, excuse me, just on September 9th, Politico reported that critical television coverage of him is illegal, and pushed back on criticism that his administration was taking actions that chill free speech. This is what Trump said to reporters in the Oval Office. When 97% of the stories are bad about a person, it's no longer free speech. And he believes that it should be illegal. So I can't believe I'm agreeing with Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz came out and said, this is dangerous as hell. And of course, this is all about the Jimmy Kimmel situation. I really think that we're teetering on a point in our republic that we haven't teetered on before. We've teetered on a lot of lines in our republic over the years, but this one basically attacks that fundamental right that we have. And first of all, how do you guys react to this concept that Trump is now positioning criticism of him should be illegal because it's criticism of the president? We'll start with you, Gerald.
I think it's probably useful to start off with the notion that the Biden administration was pressuring the Meta corporation there. And we would need to know a little bit more about that. If pressure means could you stop putting this stuff on, then it's perfectly reasonable for Zuckerberg to not be happy that the president is asking for that, because there is the sort of possibility, even if it's unstated, that the president that's telling you that he thinks you should do something could have negative consequences. So if in fact that is something that happened, then it's absolutely true that we should be discouraging that. But we also need to make sure that we're distinguishing it between what the Trump administration isn't even trying to hide, which is that they're not just saying you should not do this or you should not do that. They're literally threatening to prosecute. They're literally threatening to investigate. They're crossing a very clear legal bright line between suggesting things, which is not, at least technically, unconstitutional, to flat out violating the law, violating the constitutional principle by actually saying we're going to use the power of government to punish you for it.
Right. What's your reaction?
I think something that's particularly frightening, I think, for a reporter like myself, is that there's been direct attacks on the fourth wall. Is that no?
Estate.
The fourth estate. Thank you.
The fourth estate,
And it's terrifying as someone who's a young reporter who's going through this on a daily basis. I see how my communities I report on are affected, and I see it on a national level. And with Jimmy Kimmel last week, or was that last week? With everything in the news that happened about him, and the threats to take him off the air and then putting him back on the air, but what's he allowed to say once he's back on the air? There's just a lot of questions I have about how this is all unfolding, and it's frightening, honestly.
Yeah. The Kimmel thing is very interesting to me because I had quite a discussion at Smokey Joe's Cigar Lounge. You like cigars? Go see Smokey Joe. With a MAGA guy. He was unaware that every broadcaster has something called standards and practices. Mm-hmm. That every broadcast organization will basically say, you can talk about this, but we really don't want you talking about that. And most of the time, this is about two issues: profanity and liability, like for libel. And the thing that fascinates me about all of this is that the general public doesn't seem to realize that. Mm. They don't seem to realize that media outlets, such as newspapers and radio stations and TV stations, all share the fact that they have basically standards that they feel would put them in compliance with what the FCC wants and doesn't want. Mm-hmm. And we were talking.
It's important to point out, though, that the FCC has no authority over a newspaper. They
Right.
only have authority over
Right.
a broadcast media. Yeah.
In newspapers, I can say that the biggest issue there is whatever the political opinions of the publisher, so to speak. Mm-hmm. That forms a lot of the standards and practices. And also on the matter of profanity, what they feel that their audience and more importantly their advertisers will accept or not accept. And you know, there's this notion that, well, you can say anything you want on TV, and that's not the case. Not for broadcast
Right.
TV. Cable TV is completely different. Outlets like such as this one, cable access, completely different. But people don't seem to understand how freedom of speech is tempered. You know, when I was growing up, the old rule was, and I can't even remember which Supreme Court ruling this was, but it was, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater.
Yep.
That's not protected speech,
Right.
because it's going to cause people harm.
A clear and present danger.
Right. But it seems like these distinctions about how we use language, how we present ideas, are tempered in many different ways. And I think the problem is, and please tell me if I'm wrong on this, is that now we have an administration, there are no guidelines. You know, I've never heard a president swear at a press conference before.
Right.
And he did. He's done that a couple times. Is that right? Well, that means that a broadcast outlet has got to decide, do we just do this and this is how the president speaks, or do we bleep him?
Sure.
Or do we cut the whole thing?
Sure.
So there's a lot of rules that govern the practical application of free speech. But at this time, a lot of those rules seem to be going out of style, at least. What do you think?
I certainly see that being the case. I think that a lot of what we're used to, the norm, is not the norm anymore, and particularly under the Trump administration. We saw it in his first term, and we're seeing it again now. So I do think that it's sort of all the barriers are down. It seems like everything's sort of changing on a whim. Also, it just weekly changes.
You talked about what used to temper speech and the speech of people in the media, and of course, what always tempered them is the media marketplace, right? Well, you said, you know, the newspaper publishers use, but also what the readers are going to take. Well, we're in a very different, media marketplace, right? There's a lot of emerging scholarship about the transition away from 20th century, the media environment of the 20th century, when it would actually cost you financially. It would be a bad business move to violate those standards that were, for some, legal and for others commercial, right? But the commercial standard now is kind of the opposite. If you are a newspaper in the 20th century or a TV network, you're only competing with a couple other networks and a couple other newspapers. And that meant at the time that the newspaper or the TV station that was saying stuff out of the norm was actually doing themselves harm. They weren't going to draw more people by, if ABC says something crazy and NBC and CBS don't, that would not have sent people flocking to ABC. It would have caused them to go away. But in the 21st century, with the obvious explosion of media, internet, et cetera, you have a much more competitive mass media space. And so marketing, the business plan has to change. You can't live up to the standards and get rewarded with business. Now you have to find a niche. You have to actually be different instead of being the same. So we've gone from upholding standards because that's what the people wanted, to a situation where that's not what the market demands, because you're not going to stand out if you're competing with umpteen other outlets in some respect if you're just saying the same thing as they are. That's why the media's niche now. You've got the left-handed knitters channel, and you've got that obviously has something to do with what we all experience when we think we used to be so normal and we're so abnormal now. Well, that's because the marketplace demands abnormality so that you can stand out among a crowded field of producers of media.
Absolutely. So being the geezer of the group at age 71, I've seen throughout my lifetime how this has changed. I mean, seriously, Growing up, it was Channel 3, Channel 40, Channel 22.
Absolutely.
Now,
And 57. Don't forget 57.
I remember when 57 came on. Now, on a good day, we could get Channel 8 from New Haven, especially if I had my little brother hold the rabbit ears, because that's what that's what little brothers are for. So, you know, there was this consolidation. I mean, my family was a newspaper family. We got the Morning Union, which was the Springfield morning paper. We got the Holyoke Transcript as the evening paper. When I was working on radio, I always picked up the Springfield Daily News as well. So there was local papers, regional papers. Everything has shifted, and so much of the emphasis now, as you said, there isn't broadcasting as a proper verb is almost an oxymoron.
Absolutely.
At this point.
Now it's narrowcasting.
Now it's narrowcasting. You know, most of our media has gone the way of what magazines were, what magazines have become, which is, if you're interested, my wife is a paper crafter. She buys magazines about paper crafting. She also likes doing needlework, so she gets stuff about that. Narrowcasting. Now, my Mother's Day, those kinds of subjects would be in Family Circle or Women's Day magazine. But over the years, magazines have understood that survival means pinpointing your audience with a very specific. I mean, who would have thought that Sports Illustrated would have had problems finding readers and advertisers? Yeah. And they do. They do. I mean, they put out the swimsuit issue, but I know for a fact they were even called out because it was suspected they had AI doing some of the articles recently. So we have a completely different media landscape, and much of it is the Wild West. Yep. So you can put stuff on social media that you could never have put in a letter to the editor to a newspaper. Never.
Right.
You do hear things that are televised that you never would have heard again. And to me, one side of this is that it is giving more people more voices, which I think can be good. But on the other side, it's also giving people more opportunities to spread a whole bunch of misinformation, which I think all of us will agree that's bad.
Sure.
Yeah. Having the president now sticking his hands into this issue in the manner that he is doing, I think complicates. It doesn't simplify anything. It complicates things, because now we're at a point where what's he going to do if he decides he's already sued the New York Times. He wants to sue other papers. But what if this trickles down even more? What if he decides that an AP story that would be carried from a paper like the Republican, he didn't like? What if he names every newspaper in a lawsuit? What if he goes after every newspaper that carried that AP story, which would be easy enough to figure that out?
Right. Well, the problem is that when a network that can afford not to pays him $16 million instead of winning the case, that's a big problem, right? If the largest media outlets aren't going to hold the line for everybody else, that's a big problem. And of course, the corporatization of media is part of that problem, right? Media are part of large conglomerates now, and they're not as separate as they're supposed to be, right? The bottom line should not be part of the editorial, situation, but it is, right?
Yeah, no.
And so the people, the outlets that should be the strongest to uphold the First Amendment are showing us, at least so far, that they might not be. And you're right, because if it gets past them, it's going to be much harder for the smaller outlets to resist. And
in this case, you're talking about the ABC decision to settle $16 million for this.
For a case they would have won. The ABC would have won.
And okay, so ABC is owned by Disney, and we just saw what Disney did to Kimmel because they want to be friends with the Trump administration for business purposes. That's what.
But they were threatened. They were threatened, and they, instead of sort of reporting that they were threatened, saying this was illegal and this is outrageous, which is what they really were supposed to do, they just decided we can't afford to do that.
Right. And we're going to see similar odd things happen at CBS, because now CBS is owned by definitely a right-leaning billionaire who already has imposed upon CBS News a guy who's going to determine if the news that they run is biased. To me, this is really chilling. If you're in this,
chilling. That's the right word. Yep.
If you're in this business, so again, we get back to we're seeing a federal administration really saying and doing things. I mean, you're absolutely right. I'm sure Richard Nixon. I am sure that there were times where the Oval Office was blue with obscenities over Woodward and Bernstein and their reporting at the Washington Post. I'm sure that Lyndon Baines Johnson absolutely, totally despised the people who were, he did one classy thing, Johnson did. He actually talked about, and it was the Smothers Brothers show,
you're right.
and he did this, he actually sent them a letter saying, that what you're doing, I may not like, but this is freedom of speech, and this is, it was actually a really gracious quote from a guy who wasn't known to be gracious, but at least he did it.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
We're not going to get that with this one.
No.
And again, the more these big corporations sort of like fold
Right.
and say, oh, we need to be friends with him because it benefits our business, the worse our situation is going to get.
I mean, being afraid to take that on and win the legal battle, you might say it's understandable because the Supreme Court has made some decisions that make it seem like they're not going to serve as the check that we assume they would serve as. The idea that they defer decisions having to do with the assertion of presidential power, that's not a new idea. But when you have a court that is being so deferential in a time when the Congress is utterly unwilling to do its part of the checks and balances, it's a pretty frightening recipe for institutional breakdown.
Right.
And the press in the 20th century was one of those intermediary institutions, right, that had the ability to vet information using standards, right, so that the average American didn't even have access to disinformation, right? I tell my students all the time, when I was a kid, if I wanted to see crazy, I had to go to the grocery store and look at the National Enquirer headline, baby born pregnant, or whatever the case may be. But the newspaper didn't have craziness in it. The television didn't have, because they were institutions that were self-regulating and regulated in ways that deterred, or the marketplace was not conducive to disinformation, to niche ideas about what's true. And now, because we have this worldwide web and this Wild West economic marketplace, there's just the average American doesn't have a trusted source of information because everybody in a competition for the truth can. There's nothing stopping them from lying as flagrantly and as flamboyantly as possible. And you know what? If you're a politician in a polarized situation and you don't need the people who didn't vote for you to ever vote for you, you might as well say they're eating the dogs and cats.
Right.
Right.
I mean, when you have the Vice President of the United States admitting in a television interview that he will make stuff up,
right,
in order to get our attention.
Absolutely.
The dogs and cats, there was absolutely zero instances of that happening. Mm-hmm. The mayor of that town said that. The residents of that town said that. In fact, they were grateful for the Haitians living there because they've started businesses. They've done the whole thing where what immigrant Grits do. They buy houses, they fix them up, they have small businesses, they work together. It strengthens the community, period. But yet now you have the Vice President of the United States who basically says, hey, I'll say whatever I have to say to get people's attention.
And that's the president's, that's what he's doing, right? At one point I thought, at least he's breaking the law so flagrantly, there's no way he can win in court. And to be fair, he has lost a lot more than he's won.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it's frightening because of the court's sort of conservative jurisprudential posture. That's not new. The court has enabled presidents for 100 years. It is the Supreme Court that made the president the sole organ of foreign policy, which is something that this president has taken great advantage of. When the president declares an emergency and says we're in armed conflict, some lawyer has explained to him the only way that this wasn't a murder of 17 people on a boat is if this was armed conflict and they were combatants, etc. So he's backing into these rationales.
Even though there's no proof.
Even though there's no proof.
And if the media does a story, then what we hear the response of is, well, they're lying.
Right.
And
who do you trust?
Right.
That's the problem for the average American. You trust the side or the person who seems more like you, seems more like your people, if you will.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's scary. Very scary.
Do you run into this whole issue when you're reporting of blatant misdirection, misinformation from people? Do you find that people, whether deliberately or they're just repeating a talking point, are doing things really without judging what they're saying?
Yes, to some extent. I think the internet has made it really easy to sort of spew out misinformation. I've seen it at the local level. I've seen it really just doing any research on a topic. You have to go through. I mean, fact checking is a thing in journalism. You have to do it to publish the right information, but or to speak the right things on TV or on the radio or what have you. But I find it much harder now to prove things that are right without multiple interviews, multiple sources, multiple conversations with the same person, even to verify what they're saying is right, to ask the right questions. And I didn't grow up, well, I grew up very briefly pre-internet, so much of my life has been online.
Sure,
and so I think now with AI on TikTok and people are seeing, oh, there was a flood in Springfield, and then you go to the place where the alleged flood happened and there's nothing there. So it's much easier to spread lies, I think, than it is to be truthful, and to even I think
There's no consequences.
There's no
for
consequences for lying. Exactly. Thank you. Yeah. Things can just even publishing.
Even if you get caught,
a story.
Okay, you caught
Yeah.
me.
Right.
But
and
there's
no consequence for that. Yeah.
Unless there's a libel issue which could generate a lawsuit.
Yeah.
However, libel
what this does, it makes the journalists timid because they are in an environment, an information environment that is chaotic, right? Mm-hmm. And you have people that are essentially doing the Charlie Kirk prove me wrong thing. And the problem with that is that's backwards because you can't prove a negative. So essentially reporters are forced to be extremely vanilla and extremely, he said this, he said this, he said this, I'm in the clear. This person said the moon's made of cheese, but this person says it isn't. That's, a journalist should be able to say the moon's not made of cheese, but they are not in a position to be able to do that confidently because they don't have backing. They're not going to be backed up. They're going to be easily dismissed if it's going to cost too much to deal with it, right? So these problems for journalists is the toughest job in America. There's no question in my mind. To be a journalist and to do the job right, you're the most vulnerable. You're the most legally vulnerable, politically vulnerable, personally vulnerable, because there's just, how do you, if you're a 25-year-old young journalist, you don't have a law degree, you don't have a PhD in political science, you may not be able to nail down some fancy talking point that somebody threw at you that actually is wrong. And so what do? Well, you have to just report it and try to find somebody else out there who says it's wrong. And all you can do is say, he says it's right, he says it's wrong. Because it's not that useful.
Even with fact checking, sometimes there are things that you can't get your hands on firmly.
Right.
Absolutely.
You can think that. And again, this gets back to how people are speaking under freedom of speech, the things that they are speaking. Social media is great for many things. I really think so. But I also think social media is terrible for many things. You know, and that fits into this whole discussion a little bit, because it's clear that someone like Trump, despite the fact that he's even more of a geezer than I am, he appreciates the uncensored, unfiltered, uncontrolled nature of social media. I mean, his Truth Social messages, oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean,
The party of the devil this morning, he called the Democrats.
well, and the other thing that's popped up, and again, this affects freedom of speech, in my opinion. Just the other day, you had an AI-generated video on Trump's Truth Social about med beds.
Oh, right.
Med beds do not exist. And if you didn't hear this, in this AI video, Trump is seen talking about hospitals that he will build that have beds that can cure you. And in fact, one of the things that it is alleged to do is to, if you've been in an accident and you've got a leg missing, it will regrow your leg. Now, the fact that this was AI is one thing. The fact that the President of the United States put that on his Truth Social feed, knowing full well that he never, the Trump that's in there saying this stuff is an AI Trump. Yeah. He never said it, but yet he put that up there.
Sure.
So, yes, under freedom of speech, I guess he's got the right to do this stuff. But it's the bully pulpit of the presidency.
It's an unclear line. As the president, he is the government in a way. When the president makes a statement, he isn't as free as you and me to say he believes X, Y, and Z, because the implication is that this is something on which the government will act, which it is, right? They are actually taking concrete policy steps to prevent people from having access to vaccines. So it's not just free speech. No. He wants you to argue that when I told people, let's go down there and fight that was my free speech. He's the President of the United States. When he's standing with the seal, he's operating as a government official. So, right, that's not actually the same thing. He is making official statements of the government when he does that. And that is what makes it transgress free speech. He's not a private citizen. He's acting as the President of the United States. He breaks the law and violates constitutional principles absolutely every day.
I would think. Now, I don't know what your career goals are. I had very bad career goals. I actually like Western Massachusetts, and I stayed here, which means I doomed my wife and myself to near poverty. But most reporters, their career goal is, you work, you prove yourself, you go from a medium-sized market like Springfield to a larger market, because supposedly you're going to get paid more money, although that will be eaten up in living costs in a larger market. So I don't know what your goal is, but can you imagine being in that bunch of reporters listening to Caroline Leavitt outright lie and obfuscate? I can't say it, but I'm just like Trump. I can't say a sin feed. So can you imagine what that must be like?
I don't think I want to begin to imagine it, only because as journalists, what I was taught in school, as going to school for journalism, journalists are the watchdogs. We are the people who are supposed to, hear the lie, but also prove that it's not right and hold people accountable, especially those in power. And so right now, I think the people who are in the press room at the White House are put in a really, for lack of a better word, put in a pickle. I mean, this is a tough situation for those reporters. It's tough, even here at the local level. You hear it because we hear it every day. Everything is coming at us at full speed every day from the Trump administration. And going forward, you're thinking, how does this affect us at the local level? How do we report this here? How are changes at the federal level affecting local governments or local offices or local people. And yeah, I don't envy the people who are in the press office, in press room, and at the White House. I don't envy them, but it's a tough
situation.
Yeah, it's a tough
I mean,
situation.
half of the people in the room aren't really reporters anymore, are they?
Yeah, no, because the White House can pick and choose.
Right.
And they will be happy to throw you out.
Why are you so great, Mr. President? They're the kinds of questions.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to stray too far into territory that we may do another show about. But the bottom line is that I really think that we have we may have freedom of speech, but we have greatly diminished news gathering organizations and media outlets.
No question.
They're diminished by the fact that advertising is not what it used to be, so therefore they don't have the money that they need to do. They're also diminished by actions of this administration, such as intimidating ABC enough that they glommed out $16 million. So now you wonder, when I watch that evening news with David Murr, how much of the content is being affected by someone sitting in a newsroom at ABC going, if we run this way,
Yeah, I think a lot.
we're going to,
Let me give you an example of something about that I worry about constantly. Every time we see some horrific scene of federal agents abusing people's due process rights, and it's usually related to ICE and to immigration raids, I scream at the television why isn't the first line of every story about ICE raids that it is not a violation of criminal law to be in the country illegally? It is not a criminal law that they're breaking. It is a civil penalty.
There we go.
And so we're basically talking about people who have made an administrative error. That's why they're free until their hearing. They're not criminals. And he constantly just says they're criminals because they broke the law. That level of understanding may be understandable for the average American, but every reporter in America should never let him say that without explaining that that's not true.
Right.
But of course, he forces reporters to have 10 things like that to say because he spews 10 lies with every story. So you have to make decisions. Which ones do we call out every time? And that's the strategy. You throw everything at the wall. They're not going to be able to debunk all of them. Some will survive, and we'll use those. It's
Right.
very frustrating, but it's also pretty effective in the present media environment and in an environment where the average American really doesn't trust the kinds of institutions that used to be higher education, political parties even at a distant time in our past. We used to be places where you don't have to trust the Democrats and Republicans, but you have to know that they each have a position and figure out what it is, and that'll tell you something about what's going on. But parties have been sort of decimated by competitors in the field of information, including media. But that's really the problem. The way knowledge is developed and transmitted and disseminated has become so chaotic that we don't have what some have called a common carrier anymore. There is no place where the American people sit together and judge something by the same standards. That doesn't exist anymore.
Every time Jimmy Kimmel came back and they said that 6 million people watched his return show.
Right.
And people thought, well, that's great. Well, that's a fraction of what Johnny Carson had as a late night talk show host.
He wasn't competing with the internet.
Well, he wasn't competing with the internet. He only had 2 other networks he was competing with.
Right.
This goes back to your point. This goes back to a time where there were these common touchstones in American society. So if you're up at 11:30 at night and you don't want to go to sleep, you watch Carson.
Yep.
And Carson had that stranglehold
Yeah, you bet.
for 30 years.
Yeah.
Now, guys like Kimmel and Stephen Colbert, and both of whom I like a great deal, not so much Jimmy Fallon, these guys have got a fraction of that.
Right.
Because it is, as you said before, it's so niche,
Yep.
It's hard to have these places in American society now that are the common places.
Right.
Newspapers used to be like that as well. You know, it's very tough.
It doesn't exist.
And I don't think it's going to reverse itself at any time.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that it would. I mean, 25 years ago, the hope that the internet was going to democratize information, and in doing so, we were going to make a better democracy. Well, it turns out that more democracy isn't always good for democracy. And democratized information is particularly bad because it is without standards. It is not being filtered through intermediaries that are going to improve upon your understanding of it. Now, that conspiracy thinking is much more prevalent today because people are going and finding what they think of as authoritative people on the internet. They don't know who it really is, but why shouldn't I believe that guy more than that guy? I don't know. I'm going to believe whoever I want to believe.
Right. Makes your job a lot tougher.
A lot tougher. Crazy tough.
So we got just a couple minutes left. Let's do some predictions. Do you think that this whole situation is going to get worse before it gets better? What do you think?
There's no way it won't.
I can't see a world in which it gets better before it gets worse.
Yeah, no,
So
I think that's right.
it gets worse.
I think that's a pretty easy prediction.
Yeah.
It's definitely going to get worse before it gets better. We need to have more confrontation that is cannot be ignored. The government closure, the Democrats are basing this on some fairly narrow policy issues. But the reality is the closure of the government is going to focus people's attention a bit. And we are dealing with an unprecedented administration in terms of dishonesty and corruption, et cetera. And to be honest with you, I think it's the kind of thing that will require increasingly inescapable conflict that people can't turn their head from. Because it's so easy for us to turn our heads. It's so easy for us to worry more about the Red Sox Yankees. It's so easy. It's going to have to get harder. It's going to have to get harder for average Americans not to care.
Right.
And that's going to take some time.
And I do think it's your job, my job, your job to try to say things, to try to do things that give people real information so they can actually judge what is happening based on real things, not on the meme culture. Oh, I saw that, so it must be true. I'm going to vote this way because I saw that little thing on my Facebook page or my Instagram page. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that we're definitely. You see a phrase in history about democracy being tested, the republic being tested. We are being tested, even though it doesn't involve like a world war or it doesn't involve some huge social movement like civil rights. We're being tested right now in ways that I hate to invoke them because they're always being invoked these days, the founders.
Sure.
Never anticipated.
That's absolutely 100% true.
So, I want to thank both of you for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.
And I'm hoping that people can watch this and just think a little bit about what we've all said and maybe start their own effort to not only exercise freedom of speech, but also to exercise their thought process, to evaluate what they see and to be active in that evaluation. So, but we'll see.
You bet.
Thanks very much for tuning in for this episode of Government Matters, folks, right here on Focus Springfield.